I am also.
She
I'll.
will she'll actually be introducing you, and then you can start your PPT. She'll introduce you as
Sure,
a
sure.
speaker, then you can
So I
present.
can share the screen, right?
Yes, yes, of course. The option is there below it. Um, I've pressed record as it's not started as yet.
It hasn't.
Who's live streaming? Rose is set up.
Yes, ma'am. Rose is doing it.
Rose, please then start the live stream.
Yes, ma'am. She has started it.
Go ahead. You can introduce the speaker.
Good evening to one and all present here. I, Ashika, on behalf of Women's Studies Center, would like to welcome you all for session 3 of the certificate course module on fundamental feminist economics, relevance, and title for the session is Macroeconomic Policies in India, reflecting upon transformative ideas within a capitalist trajectory. To throw light on the topic, I would like to welcome our speaker for the session, Dr. Sona Mitra. Dr. Sona Mitra is a principal economist at IVA, Korea University, and teaches at the faculty at Ambedkar University. We'd like to- I would request the audience to kindly keep themselves on mute, and in case you have any questions or comments, kindly put them in the chat box. Now, I would request Dr. Sona Mitra to take over and enlighten us with her knowledge.
Thank you, Ishika, and thanks everybody, and thanks for inviting me to this to deliver this lecture. So I had sent some readings, but I got to know that I'll send the PDF if I mean in a short while. But let me just start the screen sharing. So I'll keep my video off and I'll share the screen so most of you have a good bandwidth. So can you all see the screen? I think you can. So I'm just going on because. So yeah, so I plan to basically speak on mostly focus on my specialization and my area where I have been working, which is basically women and work or women's labor, which is something very interesting. And I have looked at. I mean, my work has focused mainly on the transitions that women's work has had in the entire development of the Indian economy over the last two to three decades. But what I want to do is my work has placed this within the broader context of how capitalism has developed and the changes that mark the global economy. How important were they, or how significant were those for the Indian economy in terms of changing the status of women workers in a capitalist setup? Now, but today, what I plan to do is basically walk you through some of the transitions in women's labor and highlight some of the important stages of the transitions, and also focus on how do we focus on the current very important issue, which is not only important for an academic discourse, but is very important from the lens of policies, of practice, and just to give you a brief background, I'm half practitioner and half into research. So basically, I would always try to bring in a lens of a practitioner into the entire research that I have been doing, which means that while I try to explain the transitions in women's labor, um, I would also bring in the perspective of how policies have transformed or whether have not transformed to incorporate these changes in the status of women's labor, and whether those have been sufficient, insufficient, or what needs to be done. So, today, what I plan to do is basically also talk briefly about how macroeconomic policies in India. I mean, if we have time, then we will definitely focus on macroeconomic policies in India, how they have focused on incorporating women into the policy framework. But mostly, what I'm going to focus on is to make you understand. I mean, is to focus, is to build an understanding of the changes in women's labor over the say over a long period. And I understand that there are students from, I mean, this is an interdisciplinary group, and we have students from history, economics, and other social science disciplines as well. So I'll just try to make it as simple in terms of not getting into too many economics jargons or economic terms. So, having said that, I want to begin with this entire premise to start from is that women in the labor markets have always been discriminated on the basis of the unequal gender relations, and labor markets are pervasive sites of unequal gender relations, where of course the question of patriarchy and power relations operate, but there are also I mean but those also some create economic inequalities in terms of women not being able to demand the kind of remunerations or returns from the labor that often the male counterparts are able to. So labor markets have a pervasive, I mean, labor markets are site of pervasive unequal gender relations. These are also manifested in a very high degree of occupational segregation by gender, which is to say that women and men in the labor markets are often clustered in specific occupations, such as women are often found in occupations like nurses and teachers and front offices, or in tourism, but and much less in hazardous or factory type setups, while men actually, I mean, and while men are actually found in some specific occupations which are much more than what than which are much more in number than where women are clustered into. So, women's work generally has a very typical nature of clustering into certain activities, and and therefore, because they cluster into certain specific activities, there are certain other features that intensify the inequalities by keeping women's work trapped into low paid, low skilled, and low value added segments of the industry of the economy. For example, we would find most women work. I mean, we would find most women working in the service sectors at the lower ends or the lower occupational rungs, like domestic workers, or women working in the women working as beauty parlor professionals, or women working as apprentice to tailors, and women working in the apart from the service sector. We find women in agriculture, where most women we find are employed as agricultural laborers, doing mostly manual, doing performing mostly the manual labor, and not the kind of labor that requires knowledge and skill. So basically, what I'm trying to highlight here is that the unequal gender relations or the inequalities in the labor market are basically some of the inequalities in the labor market are basically a result of uh, not only the differences that men and women have in terms of accessing the jobs, or men and women have in terms of remunerations, but also in several aspects of the entire functioning of the labor market. And this is specifically due to the qualitative difference that women's work, this is essentially because women's work is qualitatively different from that of men's work. Now, why do we say that women's work is qualitatively different from that of men's work? Is specifically because women's work is actually laden with some of the historically pervasive sexual division of labor that accords women the primary responsibility and their role in social reproduction. Now, I'm told that you have had a lecture already in social reproduction, so I am not going to get to the details of this. But what I want to highlight is that women's engagement in this entire process of social reproduction actually provides canvas or provides the basis for the pervasive gender inequality in the labor market, which is to say that women who are constantly bearing the burden of social reproduction within a society and the economy are the ones who are the ones who have been therefore assigned the primary responsibility for certain specific activities like the life cycle activities, the activities of childcare, and the activities of care for sick and elderly, and also to the maintenance of household and the household chores. Now, having said that, this entire component of women's activity or women's work is very important when we try to understand women's status in the labor market, and also when we try to understand the changes that have taken place in this status. Now, moving on, we have to, it is important that we look a little backward in history around the time, say, when capitalism was fairly advanced, but yet not fully mature, and industrialization was just taking place. The putting out system was converting into a factory system of production, and women had a whole lot of housework to perform. Now, prior to industrialization, when the factory system or the factory system or and the putting out and the putting out system of production was operational, and I'm talking about that period of the around the 19th century Britain, where women's housework included production for both use values and exchange values, and most of this work that women performed within the house, when they had surplus, suppose women were producing or women were stitching garments for children or spinning yarns to stitch garments for children. If there were excess yarn, they would actually barter it against some food, processed food from some other women. So women's housework prior to industrialization included production for both use values and exchange values. However, with the advance of capitalism, the nature of production within the households by women underwent huge transformations. We can distinguish briefly between two steps. First, with the progress of industrially produced commodities, that is mainly for food and clothing, the production for exchange values within the households, that is, which was outside and independent of the capitalist sector, stopped to exist because it could no longer sustain the competition provided by the factory made counterparts, which came much cheaper. There was also an element of capitalist penetration within the household that altered production work into maintenance work, which is to say that capitalist factory production for food basically took away the food processing, half the food processing work performed by women within the housework. What happened was products like flour was being converted into breads by factories, big factories, and bread was being sold in the market. So instead of baking their own bread, it was cheaper to obtain it from the market. Similarly, once again, the preservation of food that women used to do for harsh winters in that type of a climate, in those climates, women, those preservations and packaging were also being done by factories, and women found it easier to purchase those from the markets rather than put a lot of effort to preserve, to keep that work confined within the household. So a lot of the production work that was happening within the households due to a capitalist deepening, that kind of work was transformed into maintenance work in terms of cooking and cleaning and mostly assembling. Cooking was mostly now not only about beginning from scratch, that is, bread would be available in the market and it would not begin from scratch by processing wheat into flour and flour being baked into bread. So basically, housework reduced in terms of the household production was reducing, the declining, the amount of housework therefore was coming down, and women actually had a lot of time in terms of women had a lot of time in terms of engaging themselves into the economic activities. So there was one part that while the capitalist development created a situation where the household production became unviable, it also created a situation where the capitalist penetration altered the nature of women's household work, and it while it increased women's time to engage in productive activities or economic activities, it also increased their dependence upon market and wage income, which is to say that there was a transition of women from home to the factories, which is to say that women who were being engaged in home production or household production were given the increased dependence on market and increased dependence on wage income. Women were forced to become wage workers to earn wages, and there was a transition of women from home into the factory. That is to say that women were also being forced to enter the factories to earn wages along with men. However, there is a caveat to this, that women were not so easily, the transition did not happen so easily. The transition was very slow because most women, given the social constructs and given the nature of the society where the sexual division of labor was pervasive, women still accorded highest priority to their own housework, taking care of children, cleaning and maintenance of household, basically dedicating themselves to the household chores. So there was only a segment of women who were the lower income households, women who were basically transitioning into the factories. But then we also have to understand that the push for women from home into the factories also occur when there are big changes in the system or big changes happening around, big political changes happening, such as wars or natural disasters, where economies basically get into a depression, where economies are shattered, and there is always a greater need to increase the income of the household. And within that, women are also pushed out to enter economic activities and to enter into the entire area, entire, I mean, women are forced to enter the labor market as wage workers so that the household income is increases and improves the improves, or rather keeps, maintains the status. I mean, maintains the status quo, because during wars or during any natural disaster, household incomes reduce drastically, especially for the middle and lower income households. And to keep that at a status quo level, women often transition out of homes and enter into the wage work. And therefore, while the transition was happening very slowly with capitalist development, the crisis of capitalist system, which creates, I mean, not getting deeper into this discussion, but the crisis of capitalist system, which usually manifests itself in wars or economic shocks. Around that time, the devastation or the destruction that happens within the economy forces women to join the labor force. And we find that, and the data tells us, and evidence tell us that women have always been pulled into the workforce, pulled into the labor force in times of crisis, and when in times of and when the crisis tides over, the participation of women into the workforce has always reduced. Now, this is something which is very typical of the entire concept of reserve army of labor, where women are generally taken to be this entire reserve army who are used in times of crisis and are pushed out of the labor force when the crisis tides over. So basically, one of the important characteristic of the capitalist development has been that women emerged as a latent reserve of workers ready to be drawn into the workforce as per the demand of capital. So basically, when the economy is actually downsizing itself, and the capitalists require a ready source of labor supply who would come at a cheaper rate, women wage workers often acted as that latent reserve who would be drawn into the workforce, and then post the crisis would be also the first ones to be pushed out. Now, that was a major transition that happened, and this we have seen has happened recurrent in the entire history of capitalism, that women have been brought into when capital wants to expand itself, and women have been thrown out when capital is actually contracting, or capital is actually no longer interested in reinvestment. Now, having said that, this transition did not really change the nature of work that women continued to perform. Now, women's work essentially was an extension of the housework that they would perform even within the factories. Now, here, what I want to highlight is that despite the movement of women from the confines of household into the labor market due to an advance of capitalist development, whether in crisis or whether in times of rapid expansion of capital, the role or the activities that women performed remained specified within certain roles. Now, what do we see in that? Women are getting into occupations which are usually driven by the nature of the care economy, like women becoming nurses, women becoming teachers, women working in garment factories because they had the skills of stitching and tailoring, which they honed in their household production days, which could actually be carried forward through generations and then be translated into work done in the factories. Women's role were often in the front offices or the front desk at the reception. So, what I'm trying to say is essentially, while capital pulls women into the labor force or pushes women out of the labor force, it also kind of creates their roles within the specific roles within the economy, and those roles never transcend beyond a certain boundary, thus creating a segregation, occupational segregation, and segmentation of the work done by women. And essentially, a kind of roles that women are accorded even within the realm of economic production are almost always pertain to work which demands much lower remunerations, much less wages than the male counterparts, and are essentially low skilled and low productive. Low productive meaning that low productive work often usually are accrued with much less wages than than the of course than the higher value added production processes. So basically, what I'm trying to also highlight along with this transition, that capitalism has also defined women's roles within the labor market. And that development process, because it has defined women's roles, it has also perpetuated the kind of inequalities that I had begun with, that labor markets are usually the sites of unequal gender relations. Now, having said this, while this was a continuous process, the rapid changes that took place in women's status in the labor market were observed globally in all the countries of both global north and global south, and that was mainly since the late 1970s or the early 1980s. That is when the period, that is what we call the beginning of the commencing of the period of globalization. And what we find is that in the period of globalization, while there were substantial restructuring of economies, there were substantial changes in the labor market driven by the economic restructuring, and there were changes in the essential structures of the or systemic changes in the labor market that affected women's status. Very little change was observed in the domestic responsibility of women. So, therefore, if we take globalization as one of the significant transitions in the development of capitalism, and why I'm taking globalization, because late 70s, early 80s mark a period where much more or many women, a huge proportion of women started joining the labor force. Before that, the labor force participation rates of women globally were much less than 40%. Post globalization across the globe, there has been an increasing participation of women in the labor force at increasing rates, which is to say that while globalization created multiple avenues for capital to expand by the economic restructuring process, which I'll explain in a little bit, that also attracted a lot of women into the fold of production and therefore into the fold of the labor force. However, what it did not do was it did not bring about any change in women's roles within the household or within the society in terms of their primary responsibility for taking care of the domestic work. So while there was a change in terms of increased labor force participation, there was a continuity in terms of women's domestic responsibilities. And that is something which is very important to understand in the context of the current labor market status of women, where women are constantly struggling. Women workers or women labor is women workers are constantly struggling to take care of the domestic as well as their productive engagement, and there is always a competition of time for uh, engaging with economic productive activities, or whether being able to take care of the household and the children and the other members of the family. This picture basically is something that I wanted to highlight to show that home based work for women, while have changed its forms and changed its nature, but and the products have changed, the production processes have changed, and there has been a change in the methods and mechanisms of production, but women's domestic responsibilities, childcare responsibilities continue to prevail and is manifested in different forms throughout history. Having shown this, what do we understand by economic restructuring? So we need to explain this a little bit more for better clarity on what does economic restructuring entail. Now, one of the most important, and now I mean, I just gave you an idea of the transition during the early days of capitalism. But right now, we would, and I jumped into the, I mean, without discussing much in between, I have jumped to the 20th century globalization, and I'm trying, and I would be explaining the economic restructuring over that period, mainly because that was one of the landmarks in terms of women's participation in the labor market all across the globe, which is why I'm focusing more on that. Now, one of the important features of globalization was the expansion of capital, and the multipliers, or the way the capital multiplied itself, was phenomenal, and some of the process through which it was multiplying is called the economic restructuring. So one of the important mechanisms with which capital was expanding was relocation of the production process. So for example, globalization marked the changes in the production process by breaking the process into several multiple small methods or small mechanisms or small cohorts which were located in different parts of the world. For example, an automobile manufacturing setup like Ford, which was absolutely producing from the United States of America or North America for that matter, started breaking up its production process into different parts of the motor vehicle. So there would be a factory or a workshop which would be producing only one part of the entire automobile. There would be that. So the automobile factory was broken up into several parts. One would be producing the body, the other would be producing the engine, some other would be specializing in production of the gearbox, some other would be also engaged in producing the other accessories of the motor vehicle. So it would be divided up into multiple production sites, and most of these production sites would be located not in the United States of America, but in the global countries of the global south, like in South Asia or Southeast Asia. Why would that happen? Essentially, that would happen because these locations, these locations are the countries, the developing countries in South Asia or Southeast Asia, are essentially labor surplus countries. Most of the laborers or most of the working population remain engaged or remain concentrated within agriculture, and the sector is often a sector which has surplus labor. The moment the manufacturing sector, via these relocation of production processes, starts developing, a large part of that agricultural surplus labor starts moving into these factories as labor supply. And these laborers come at a very cheap rate. The wages of these workers are much lower, at least 100 times lower than what one would have to pay if they employed labor in the United States of America or the continents of North America, which means that the amount of profit that capital would generate by employing such cheap labor is massive. And that was one of the key reasons for relocating the production processes to the developing countries. Now, even within these developing countries, the cheapest form of labor came as cheapest form of labor were those of women, because women were the most flexible, most volatile, and very fluid, latent reserve army waiting for a catch by these relocated multinational giants of automobiles or garments. Now, think about multinational corporations of garment chains, multinational corporations of automobiles, multinational corporations of electronic devices, mobile phones, or consumer durables. All of the production processes are now broken up into several parts, and they are relocated in different parts of the world, especially in the developing countries where labor comes cheap and capital has the opportunity to reap as much profit as possible than they could have done in the countries of the global north. So what it entailed, this economic restructuring process, what it entailed was to attract and pull a large number of women, to the extent that most Southeast Asian countries actually saw a process of feminization of their manufacturing sector. Feminization essentially means that the share of women within a sector actually is higher than the share of men in that sector. And that was precisely because women came as a group of flexible, cheap labor supply, and the cohort that could essentially garner as much profit for the capital as possible. Now, and these were being facilitated by the emergence of new trade systems that were operating within the globe. So there was a North American free trade agreements operating, new production chains developing. For example, the supply chains that we keep talking about, the new production chains or the supply chains that we keep talking about, say, for example, in the garment production. So there is so for example, one of the very good example of production chains can be explained by the garment manufacturing, where these sports giants like Nike or Adidas would actually manufacture their shoes, parts of their shoes in different parts of the globe. So you'll find Vietnam producing the sole of the shoe, and Cambodia producing the lace, and the upper part of the shoe being produced in Sri Lanka, and all of these being assembled in another country or maybe in Bangladesh. So, and then you would find that this is a product which is made in Bangladesh, because that is the final assembling point. Now, production chains essentially created these several layers of supply chains within which women were drawn into the factories, and there was a large chunk of women who were sitting at home and also being engaged in producing for these factories in their own home-based setups. So you see, what is happening is the transition of capitalism from a much slower process into a much rapid expansion of capital in the period of globalization, which usually we call as neoliberalism, which has perpetuated many inequalities, has created a large share of labor force which comprise of women situated at the bottom of the production chains and producing for the multinational corporations at much cheaper rates, and also handling their domestic responsibilities, which they used to do even earlier. So, what do we see with this economic restructuring is that there is a re-emergence of the putting out system in the home-based setups, and there is a new industrial division of labor that involves rapid changes. The new industrial division of labor is the change between the labor supply of the global north and the labor supply of the global south, where the labor supply of the global south has a big proportion of women, very cheap labor, and women who are easily used by the capital when it is expanding and thrown out when it is stagnating or is not interested in reinvestment. Now, therefore, the transitions caused many changes within the state for the status of women in the transition caused many changes in the status of women in the labor market, and what it essentially entailed is an increased informal sector jobs for women. So while there was a period in the 90s when globalization was actually expanding the production processes, there was an emergence of women in developing Asia who worked in large chunks in the factories, became wage earners in their rights. Also, that created some amount of empowerment within them, given the financial independence that they enjoyed. But it also created high bargaining power within those women. And the moment women started organizing themselves into positions of higher bargaining, what we find is that capital flights started taking place, which is to say that when women became empowered in countries to bargain for higher wages, the reduced profits basically drove capital to leave the country and move to some other country where women were still unorganized and were still providing cheap labor supply. Now, this is essentially the political economy of globalization and the changes in the nature of women's work. Now, this is one part. The other part is whether these changes created some amount of, or whether these changes created any kind of empowerment among women in the developing world. So what I just discussed was, while it provided some amount of financial independence and the sense of agency for women, what it also did was that the increased agency and empowerment did not last long, because capital was very powerful and it could pull itself out and relocate to a different production site. Now, this kind of in and out of labor force basically created a large chunk of female workforce or female labor force who were pushed into the sector which we refer to as informal sector. Now, if we look at the developing countries, or more specifically developing Asia, South Asia, more than 90% of women labor or work in the informal sector. And what is this informal sector essentially? It is essentially a sector which does not provide decent work conditions to their workers. There is there are no minimum wages. There are no legislations to support social security. There are no legislations to provide insurances. There are no legislations to provide basic rights of workers, like right to paid leave provisions or maternity leave provisions. And this informal has expanded among the women workers as a result of this rapid capitalist expansion under globalization. So what I want to highlight here is basically that what capitalism has done essentially in its transitions and also in its major expansionary mode is that it has created a large chunk of labor force, women labor force, who have been pushed into the most um, most lowly remunerated and most hazardous and vulnerable section or segment of the labor market. In addition, what it has also done, it has created a dependence of these women on wage work, and it has not facilitated the other primary responsibility that was accorded to women by the sheer sexual division of labor, that is, their responsibility towards the domestic, the household and child care and care of other family members. And this essentially forms or comprise of the phenomena of double burden of women's work. Now, understanding the double burden is very important because that essentially perpetuates and keeps the inequality in the labor market going, because the double burden is basically the burden of women to earn wages in the economic realm and also cater to the needs of the domestic. And this is where one part of the double burden, which is women's unpaid work, is very important to understand and very crucial for an economy or a society to function. Because without women's unpaid work, the entire economy and society would collapse, because the entire process of social reproduction would come to a standstill. So, and to understand unpaid work, of course, it is a consequence of the rigid social constructs and the patriarchal norms that stem from the sexual division of labor. But essentially, one needs to understand that it is also a very important feature of capitalism or the capitalist development process, where women, because they have to be used as a flexible labor force, that change of role is not something that is actually that comes spontaneous to the system. So the status quo of women taking care of the household and coming in an ad hoc manner into the labor force, moving in and out, is something that suits the purpose of this kind of a capitalist development. And this is at the root of the inequalities that prevail in the labor markets. And therefore, when we have to understand women's work, we really need to understand women's work not only by looking at women workers, but to look at all women who are part of the labor force and who are out of the labor force and who are potentially the ones to enter the labor force in future. And therefore, the entire continuum of paid work, underpaid work, unpaid work, and the care work needs to be understood to understand the entire to approach women, approach the entire question of women's labor, and to understand or examine the status of women workers in any economy or society. And here I would just take a pause and show you this graph, which is a recent one, where you find that this phenomena of women engaging in unpaid work is a global phenomena. However, there are variations in the time spent on unpaid work by women all across the world. So if we find that the unpaid work and paid work divisions for women are much more egalitarian in the developed countries or the advanced capitalist economies compared to what we find in the Asia and the Pacific or the Arab states, or specifically in the low income countries. And this is to say that, and this basically provides us with this entire idea, or provides us to understand that while women's work underwent a lot of change with the development of capitalism, but the nature of women's domestic responsibilities have undergone much less change than required, or than would have been required. Having said this, I just want to also bring your attention, since we are talking about this, that this process of women's work, this double burden of women's work, is essentially also one of the challenges that women face in the labor market, where a large chunk of their activity, a large chunk of their work is often invisibilized within the economy. It is not recognized as productive activity. Women's domestic work, household work, child care, care of the other family members, elderly and sick, these activities are not recognized in any system of national accounts, and therefore these are always unremunerated and never get counted, and therefore this work of women remains invisibilized, and this entire process of non-recognition is called the challenge of invisibilization of women's work, and this is very severe in the Indian context. For example, just to highlight that, while women's work days are almost 2 hours longer than men, women perform 5 hours of more unpaid work compared to men in a single day, and this is by a conservative estimate provided by the Time Use survey conducted by the Government of India in 2019. So women spend 5 hours more on unpaid work than men, and that unpaid work for women, and this is a very severe number, and it is much severe, and this number in India is very severe because, and is very close to the Arab countries and Pakistan and Afghanistan in South Asia, unfortunately. Because if we look at our other South Asian neighbors like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or in Southeast Asia, of course, women perform more unpaid work than men, but the gap is much less than 5 hours. So it is to be said that this invisibilization of so much work of women is something that perpetuates the inequalities in terms of not only accessing the labor markets, not only accessing the jobs to enter the labor market, it is also one of the important factors that provide less remunerations and perpetuates the wage gap, the gender wage gap within the labor market. Because often we hear employers citing the reason that women cannot work for a longer period of time, and because they work for less number of hours in the productive economy, their wages are less than men. So there is this basis of, but suppose we had a situation where women's unpaid work was less than 5 hours or were on equal footing with men, then women would be working for equal number of hours in the labor market like men. Now, while this is very important to acknowledge, even that does not provide equal wages because of the reason that I spoke earlier, that women's roles or women's occupations are driven by women's roles within the domestic, and those occupations are essentially the ones which lie at the bottom of the economy, such as domestic workers, our maids and cooks and nannies and all of those women who are toiling day in and day out, that and women's work in the garment factories. If you look at women in the factories, they are situated at the lowest end of the production chain. Women would be doing the finishing work, women would be cutting threads, but they would not be doing any skilled jobs. A recent study which IWAGE had been do, I mean, in IWAGE, one of our partners did for us. One of the studies showed us that there were very few opportunities for women to rise up as supervisors into the factories, and that actually took a lot of toll for women in their domestic activities, in their domestic responsibilities. So, having said that, while there is this challenge of invisibilization of a large chunk of work that women perform, which takes away a lot of time for women, which has a very high opportunity cost in terms of women being trained into high skills or trained or provided better education or work for longer hours in the productive economy. There is also the question of occupational segregation. There is also the question of occupational segregation that perpetuates the gender inequalities within the labor market. Now, and why did I narrow it down to these two things? Because when we talk about macroeconomic policies, these are the very two important components that should be part of the policy designs when policies are being framed to bring about to bring about equality or to bring about equity, even equity. So so in the last part of my today's lecture, I would just briefly discuss that this entire question of can the current macroeconomic policy framework play a role in tempering these labor market inequalities? Now, often these macroeconomic policies have been referred to by the policymakers as gender neutral because the policies start from a level where they do not really recognize these inequalities that capitalist development brings about. One, the inequality that is perpetuated by the double burden of women's work, and second, the inequality that is perpetuated by the stringent and rigid occupational segregation, where women are mostly concentrated in occupations which do not provide very high remunerations or decent working conditions and push women into the informal. The one of the first steps to and therefore these policies are not only not gender neutral, they are actually in essence gender blind. And therefore, to move out from this gender blindness of the policies and to integrate gender into these policies, one of the most important point is to begin by recognizing these inequalities, by recognizing the structural and the systemic issues of double burden, women's unpaid work, and the occupational inequalities operating at the social, economic, and political spectrum. It is important to engender the macroeconomic policies because it is not the only way to restructure the social constructs, because the restructuring of social constructs is a much bigger concept and can be brought about by consciousness generation through movements and many other ways. But macroeconomic policies can provide probably some temporary respites. However, we need to remember, and I would end with that these temporary respites are always temporary in nature, because the process of capitalism or the process of the development under capitalism necessarily feeds on these inequalities, because capital is always in search of profit and needs to expand and needs to increase their profit. And the pervasive gender inequality is required to sustain this system. So, of course, any change would have its own limitation unless the entire system is overhauled. So I would stop here and would take questions.
Thank you, Sona. The thing is, we could not see your slides beyond slide 1. Do you think we could just quickly...
Oh, really?
Yeah, we were still on introductory slide 1. Maybe
Oh,
you were navigating it in your system, but the one that was presenting was on slide one. Could we just quickly
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure, sure,
run through
sure.
the slides? Yeah.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Hmm.
okay. So just okay. So I'll just spend a few seconds on each slide.
Yes, please.
I think one of the important slide was this one, which I wanted to show,
Right.
and then there was this another important slide where I wanted to show the continuum, um, and then I would also like to focus on this one where the
The graph
dimensions of
you were talking about?
this graph. Yes,
Right.
can you see it?
Now we can. Yes.
Ah, right. Oh, it's actually working at a little lag. So this is the one where you find that low income countries and the Pacific, where unpaid work of women is much higher than that compared to the countries of the global north. And or the high income countries, and these are some of the numbers for India, which are so stark that it is very difficult to believe, but it is a fact. And these are still underestimations of the amount of time spent by women to perform the unpaid chores in a day. And finally, the last slide was this one. I'm so sorry that I didn't even realize that you couldn't see the slide.
Was there any other particular slide, ladies,
Yeah,
participants, would you
anything.
like us to go back to? An argument or some figures that Dr. Mitra
Maybe
shared
do
you
you
wanted
want
to look
to
at?
have a look at this?
Yes, sir. Sona, this that helps. I think you've taken us to the important ones.
Maybe you would want to look at this one, the economic restructuring process. I can do that.
So, ladies, the floor is open for questions and comments. Um, please feel free to unmute and speak, or if you'd like to put it down in the chat box, you could do that as well.
So can I stop sharing?
Sure, sure. So, who's moderating? Okay. Yes, go ahead, Shrishti.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture and the presentation. I would like to draw on the point about the double burden of work on women and the lack of recognition of the unpaid work that they do. In corporates or in the corporate atmosphere, even in the formal sector, women often have a disadvantage when they are being hired. The argument made is that it leads to additional cost for the firm. That if they hire more than 10 women, they have to have childcare services, and that reduces the profits for the company. So, uh, uh, the lack of recognition of women's work leads to a disadvantage. But then, how does one combat that, or what would be the argument against that? That would be my first question. And the second one would be, when you say that the macroeconomic policies are gender blind, and there is nothing as a neutral gender policy, either it is reinforcing status quo or it is changing the thing, then what could you give probably one example of what gender mainstreaming would look like in the Indian macroeconomic context? Yeah, that that is something.
Should I take one by one, or can I take a few questions and respond?
I think you could answer, since she's asked two questions, maybe we'd like to.
Okay. So basically, thanks for your question. What the you see, in the policy, actually, one of the ways of incorporating or including gender is by, you know, um, you know, there are several tools and mechanisms through which you can incorporate gender into the policies. Now, the social sector policies, which are basically taking care of, women's access to service deliveries or women's access to education, health, and all, these are very easy to be include. I mean, to include the requirements and needs for women. Uh, in the labor market, when we talk about including women into the considerations, is something when we say that when you're framing the macroeconomic policy design. So basically, to start from the whole idea that the input and output in the economy, those have to consider the contributions of women in the unpaid work. That is to say that recognize the contribution, recognize women's unpaid work, count them if you do not want to count them in the GDP, but at least count them, impute values, and provide that to the women who are actually working in the domestic sphere. To be very clear, what I want to say is basically you can do a valuation of women's unpaid work. That can be done by several methods that have been devised over the years through academic discourses. And there are methods of inputting. There are methods of input output. But one of the rather more important thing that I would say that it is very important to have a political will for including gender into the entire discourse. So if you are adopting gender responsive budgeting, which is one of the tools for including women into the entire process of planning, and then moving ahead with the needs that the tool actually the tool actually gives an idea of. So that is one way. But we have seen that despite adopting several tools that actually talk about bringing gender equality, many economies have not been able to do so because those tools have been rendered useless, because the awareness about gender requirements have been much lower. So one of the important things is to raise awareness in the legislators and the policymakers to increase, to understand the nature of women's work, the nature of women's contribution, and that is going to lead to including women into the policies. I think that is where the basic change lies. Otherwise, there can be many short-term small changes that can keep happening and also just wither away with time. So that was my answer to your first question. The second question, your second question was about the double burden.
And the first question was about...
The first question was about the double burden, right?
Right. Like women face double burden and there is lack of recognition of the unpaid work. And when we ask or when the policies require the employers to provide that social cost, let's say in terms of providing childcare, it leads to additional cost of hiring women. So it is seen as a disadvantage. Yeah.
Got it. I'm sorry because I couldn't concentrate. My 2-year-old daughter was crying outside the door. She was howling, so I just couldn't concentrate. I'm really sorry about that. So,
no problem, ma'am. Thank you so much.
but yeah, she's just howling. But anyway, I think it's managed. But anyway, so yeah.
Do you need to attend to her sooner? Do you need to?
Yeah. I can be there for another 5 minutes or so. It's okay, Maya. So, Shrishti, just to answer this question, that of course there is this question. It is not only about providing childcare facilities in the premises or providing maternity leaves and provisions for those, because those do bear a cost on smaller companies which are trying to keep themselves afloat or viable. What one can do is essentially that ask for the government. It's very important that the state has to step up its role in terms of providing incentives to such companies where they have more facilities which attract women workers. The state has to provide subsidies or incentivize any such step taken by companies to include more women in the workforce. So that is one way of negotiating this. And the other thing is, of course, raising the social awareness, because even if it is a cost which increases, even if it is a cost that increases the cost for the company, but that is something that has to be provided. Like machineries for the company have to be purchased to run the factory. It is like that. So one has to understand that these are part of the setup and not anything extra that is being done.
All right, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accommodating my question. Thank you so much.
No issues.
I think we should, if there's nothing immediate in the comment box, we should relieve the speaker. She has a little.
Thanks so much for that.
Okay, go ahead and give the thank you note, please, ladies.
Ishika, can you take over for the thank you note?
As we come to an end of the session, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude Dr. Sona Mitra for taking out time to enlighten us with the knowledge. I would also like to thank our convener, Dr. Maya John, and other WSC staff advisors for their constant support and guidance. At the last, I would like to thank you all, the attendees, to join us today.
Thanks a lot, Sona. We look forward to the PPT and readings.
Yes, I will send it to you, Maya.
Great.
Thank you.
Please take care.